It's always curious that as humans, we know significantly more about space and things outside our atmosphere than we do about those on our own planet. As of 2022, we have only explored about 5% of our oceans. Some conspiracy theorists might have you believe that we abandoned ocean exploration in the 1970s after finding something alarming and terrifying. More realistically, it's because of the intense ocean pressures that render us unable to survive in the austere conditions beneath the waves. But with so much being undiscovered, there are reasons to believe that many things unknown to us lurk in the shadowy black depths. Stories of the murky oblivion have permeated our society since the dawn of time. Mysterious creatures and even entire cities being swallowed up and vanishing forever. This episode will cover some of those. I'm Nick, your host, and this is Chapter 31 of the Insidious Agenda podcast, titled Into the Deep, Atlantis, Sirens, and the Kraken. The first person to discuss the theory of Atlantis is the renowned Greek philosopher Plato, stemming from his dialogues called the Timaeus and Critias. These works speak of the Athenian statesman Solon, who would make occasional trips to Egypt between 590 and 580 BC. The purpose of Solon's trips was to translate Egyptian records of the city of Atlantis. In the year 360 BC, Plato would write, "For it is related in our records how once upon a time your state stayed the course of a mighty host, which, starting from a distant point in the Atlantic Ocean, was insolently advancing to attack the whole of Europe and Asia to boot. For the ocean there was at that time navigable, for in front of the mouth which you Greeks call, as you say, the Pillars of Heracles, there lay an island which was larger than Libya and Asia together, and it was possible for the travelers of that time to cross to it from other islands, and from islands to the whole of the continent over against them which encompasses that veritable ocean. For all that we have here, lying within the mouth of which we speak, is evidently a haven having a narrow entrance. Beyond that yonder is a real ocean, and the land surrounding it may most rightly be called, in the fullest and truest sense, a continent. Now, in this island of Atlantis, there existed a confederation of kings of great and marvelous power, which held sway over all the island, and over many other islands also, and parts of the continent. With this revelation, Plato also mentions that Solon had only heard stories of Atlantis. During his lifetime, Solon attempted to create an oral history of Atlantis in poetry, although he never finished it. If he had, we can imagine that the work would have rivaled the classics like the Iliad or the Odyssey. Solon did pass the stories to his friend Dropides, and it would be through his family that it would find its way to Critias. For it was the belief of the politician Critias that Athens and Atlantis were conflicting societies, representing the opposite of one another. Athens was deemed to be the perfect society. Critias also believed that the ancient Hellenistic deities that divided the land, and Poseidon, the god of the sea, found Atlantis to his liking. For Atlantis, in Plato's words, was an island that consisted mostly of mountains in the northern parts as well as scattered along the shore. There was a great plain that extended 3,000 stadia, or around 345 miles by today's measure. There was another island, just off its coast, only about half a mile in diameter, but surely, like many things at the time, Atlantis had to have its own origin story, right? Well, it did. In the story told by Plato, the god Poseidon fell in love with the daughter of Evenor and Leucippe, Cleito. The couple went on to have 5 sets of male twins. Their eldest child, Atlas, was crowned the rightful king of Atlantis and its ocean. If you haven't figured it out by now, of course it was named the Atlantic Ocean in his honor. His twin brother, Gadeirus, was given the outside part of the island, near the Pillars of Hercules. The twins' other brothers were each given large areas of territory, with many men to rule over. Into the largest mountain, Poseidon carved a palace. It was encircled by 3 moats, each with increasing width. The people of Atlantis were able to build bridges across them to reach other parts of the island, in addition to digging a great canal, which granted them access to the sea. In Poseidon's moats, they carved tunnels so that boats could travel throughout the island. Gates and towers stood watch over every passage in the city, whose walls were made of red, white, and black rocks taken from the moats. Many features of Atlantis were covered in brass, tin, and orichalcum. Set on the island was a great golden statue of Poseidon and a massive temple to accompany it that was said to be built by his sons. The statue was built entirely of gold and depicted Poseidon in a chariot driven by 2 winged horses. The roof of the temple was a great spiral which was said to be so high that clouds drifted through it. On the central island was a great capital city adorned in gold and silver. Life in Atlantis was no different than one would expect of the times. The people there raised animals and grew crops in the fertile soil. It also helped that they were masters of architecture and developed an incredible irrigation system. As we've mentioned, they had access to precious metals, and the Atlanteans even had a love for crystals. Over time, they became a great naval power and began to expand outward, looking to further the ideals of their island utopia. One theory, and this one's a bit out there, literally, holds that the original Atlanteans were actually aliens who came to Earth from the Lyrian star system. These aliens were able to manipulate the weather and could even modify volcanic eruptions. They were superior to humans and may have even had plans to usher in a new age of enlightened rule with themselves at the head. This ties in with Plato's original story, as the Atlanteans were said to be half god and half human. I won't go into much more detail about this, as the theory does dive quite deep and could be an episode on its own, or tie into something else. Wink wink. The Atlanteans eventually came into conflict with the people of Gibraltar 9,000 years before the story of Critias. The might of Atlantis was not to be tested. They were able to overcome Gibraltar and even spread so far as Libya and Egypt. The conquests of the Atlanteans even made it so far as to reach Tyrrhenia, or modern-day Tuscany in Italy, where they enslaved the local populace. The Greeks of Athens led a great resistance against the Atlanteans, and, after everyone had eventually abandoned them, alone they were able to conquer and drive them from their homeland. Poseidon, whether having grown displeased with the Atlanteans in general, or their failure in combat, bequeathed his wrath upon them. But afterwards, there occurred violent earthquakes and floods and in a single day and night of misfortune, all your warlike men in a body sank into the earth, and the island of Atlantis in like manner disappeared in the depths of the sea. For which reason the sea in those parts is impassable and impenetrable, because there is a shoal of mud in the way, and this was caused by the subsidence of the island. So just as strangely and mysteriously as it had come to be, Atlantis was gone. Outside of the original work from Plato in 360 BC, we really have no other information on Atlantis. Everything that has come about since, and everything we know today, is purely hypothetical and speculative. Around the time of expansionism and the colonialization in the 16th century, many explorers began to associate Atlantis with the Americas, with German scholar Athanasius Kircher believing Plato's story, that Atlantis was a small continent in the Atlantic Ocean with a culture that was similar to that of the Mayans. The legend was further expanded upon through the imagination of Abraham Ortelius, a famous cartographer and geographer who is credited with having created the first modern atlas. He was the first person to believe that all of the world's continents were once joined, the idea known as Pangaea, before they separated and became to rest in their current locations. Unless it is a fable, he said, the island of Gadir, or Gades, will be the remaining part of the island of Atlantis, or America, which is not sunk as Plato reports in the Timaeus. So much as torn away from Europe and Africa by earthquakes and flood, the traces of the ruptures are shown by the projections of Europe and Africa, and the indentations of America are in the parts of the coasts of these three said lands that face each other to anyone who, using a map of the world, carefully considered them, so that anyone may say that what Plato says of the island of Atlantis on the authority of Solon is not a figment. Modern popularity surrounding the legend of Atlantis was born in 1882 through Ignatius Donnelly's work Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. Inspired by the workings of Mayanism, he attempted to draw the conclusion that all ancient civilizations of the world were drawn from Atlantis. He was able to draw similarities between stories of creation in the Old and New Worlds, and believed that the famed Garden of Eden was actually on the island. Of course, with his Christian-leaning beliefs, Atlantis was washed away in the Great Flood that destroyed the world as mentioned in the Bible. Donnelly's work would go on to inspire Helena Blavatsky and her Theosophists. She penned a work known as The Secret Doctrine, which she claimed was originally dictated in Atlantis. Her work held that Atlanteans were cultural heroes, which clashed with Plato's work stating they were a military power. Blavatsky's theories had Atlantis peaking somewhere between 1,000,000 and 900,000 years before her writing, and that it was through internal warfare and their use of, get this, psychic abilities and supernatural powers that they destroyed themselves. If we tie back to the theory that they were aliens from the Lyrian star system, I suppose that they could be supernatural in origin. An interesting thing she mentioned is that Atlanteans were olive-skinned people and might have been the ancient ancestors of North American indigenous peoples, Mongolians, and Mayans. Further expanding on this work would be the National Socialists of 20th century Germany, who tried to tie the Aryan Nordic master race as being some kind of Nordic Atlanteans. Of course, this was all pure conjecture, and Atlantis was not the ancestral home of the Caucasian race, as up until that point, all esoteric and theosophic belief taught that Atlanteans were non-Caucasian and were actually brown-skinned people. And I'd be amiss if I didn't put this in here to satisfy the, for lack of a better term, ancient alien side of me. The clairvoyant Edgar Cayce was often a major proponent of the Atlantis belief. During his life, he did many readings for people. Some of these he claimed to be reincarnations of the people of Atlantis, using their collective consciousness, known as the Akashic Records. And I'll cover that in a future episode, I promise. He was able to give amazingly detailed descriptions of Atlantis. Case predicted that Atlantis would rise again in the 1960s, as the legend became incredibly popular at that time. That didn't happen, and of course the closest we've come to Atlantis, since at least the time of Plato, is in the Marvel character Namor and his ancestral home of Atlantis, later renamed Talokan. Another curious belief that Case held is that many Atlantean records actually survived its destruction and are now being held beneath the Egyptian Sphinx. Modern belief in Atlantis is that it is purely the imagination of Plato, who used it to illustrate what a society could be and re-examine ideas of government and power. It's the belief that his writings and readings and discussions with Solon are nothing more than pure invention. But with it, it hasn't stopped humans from attempting to find the lost utopia. The first theory, due to its general proximity to Greece, is that Atlantis existed and now lies somewhere in or around the Mediterranean Sea. Places like Sardinia, Crete, Santorini, Sicily, Cyprus, and Malta are all existent as possibilities. A possible reference could have also been the famed city of Hellenistic fame, Troy, albeit Troy was land-based, and the description doesn't really match that of Atlantis. In the southeast of Greece, an area known as the Laconian Gulf once stood mountains known as the Pillars of Hercules. It's possible that this is where Plato drew his iconic feature names. The city might have even existed in the Atlantic Ocean, somewhere off the coast of Spain and Gibraltar. Places like the Canary Islands, the Madeira Islands, and even the Azores have existed as possible locations. Other parts of Europe and the North Sea might have been home to Atlantis. The list can go on and on as we rope in places like the Caribbean, Indonesia, and even the Bermuda Triangle. Normally, if a location matches the general description, and there has been some form of volcanic activity there, you'll find a reason to believe that it might have once been Atlantis. And in all honesty, this is where the story of Atlantis ends, with humanity chasing for something that likely never existed. There may come a day when we discover human ruins found under the crashing waves of our ocean, but the more plausible explanation is that Atlantis, for its beauty and prosperity, might have been the creation in the mind of a famous Greek philosopher. Like with any mystery, we'll never know it was real until we stumble across it. But if we ever find ourselves submerged, seeking the legend that might have once been, we may stumble across other things far more unimaginable. Homer's Odyssey was the first to mention the name of the Sirens, though he never provided any description of what they looked like. There were only a handful, with numbers being debated between 2 and 8, names such as Paisino, which means affecting the mind, Aglape, the splendid voice, and Thalsippia, the charming voice. After passing by them, Odysseus was curious about what he was hearing from the Sirens. He was advised by his lover, the goddess Circe, to have all of his soldiers plug their ears with beeswax and lash him to the ship's mast with explicit direction that no matter how much he begged, they were not to untie him. He was wise to heed Circe's words, as she would describe him the Sirens' behavior. They are lolling there, in their meadow, round them heaps of corpses rotting away, rags of skin shriveling on their bones. Their song drove Odysseus wild, and he begged to be untied, but his ship's company only tightened the restraints. After passing the Sirens by, and no longer being able to hear their songs, Odysseus was released. This was also the first work in which the sirens were understood to be cannibalistic. Through the Argonautica work of Apollonius of Rhodes in the 3rd century BC, we finally understood that sirens were part women and part bird. It was in this work that we learn the story of Jason, who, with his Argonauts, set out in search of the Golden Fleece. Before leaving, he was warned by Chiron to be wary of the treacherous songs of the sirens. Thinking on his feet, Jason brought along the musician Orpheus. As the ship began to traverse into the sirens' waters, their song began to be heard. Orpheus started to play music that was more beautiful than that of the sirens, drowning them out and ensuring the safety of the crew. Well, the safety of all but Buddhas, who heard the siren song and jumped overboard to swim to them. Buddhas, however, was promptly returned to the ship by Aphrodite, who saved his life. Centuries later, they began to be more commonly known as female-headed birds, their bodies adorned with birds' feathers and scaly feet, later evolving to have female upper bodies. And they could even play musical instruments, like the lyre, kithara, or aulos, and this is where we get the idea of the siren song, which I'll touch on shortly. There were also male sirens in some stories, but those disappeared around the time of the 5th century BC. Over 1,000 years later, in the 8th century AD, the term mermaid began to appear in the book Liber Monstrorum, where they were described as sea girls, with the bodies of a maiden and scaly fishtails. Initially, sirens were companions of Persephone, the daughter of Zeus, when Persephone was taken by Hades to have her become his wife. The sirens were given wings by the goddess Demeter to attempt to rescue her. In other legends, Demeter was displeased with the sirens for not having intervened in the abduction, and she cursed them. They would only live so long as mortals would hear their songs and pass them by. So if we take this explanation for their judgment or curse, then when Odysseus was able to pass by the sirens, it's likely those sirens present perished. Another states that the sirens entered a singing contest with the Greek muses. After having lost, their feathers were ripped out and used to make crowns for the victors. The sirens, anguished by their loss, turned a shade of white and fell in the Sea of Aptera, forming the islands that exist in the bay today near Suda, aptly known as the White Ones. Possibly the version of sirens that we know best comes from the work Etymology by Isidore of Seville in the 6th century. The Greeks imagine that there were 3 sirens, part virgins, part birds, with wings and claws. One of them sang, another played a flute, and the third the lyre. They drew sailors, decoyed by song to shipwreck. According to the truth, however, they were prostitutes who led travelers down to poverty and were said to impose shipwreck upon them. They had wings and claws because love flies and wounds. They are said to have stayed in the waves because a wave created the goddess Venus. Furthering Isidore's explanations, this points to why we often see sirens as being sexualized and beautiful women. Also, highly likely is the idea of a siren being another name for a prostitute, or courtesan, and this is where it comes from. The legend of the sirens continued through the periods of the Renaissance and the Age of Exploration. One of the greatest depictions was given by Jesuit writer Cornelius a Lapide in the 17th century, much a confirmation of what we know already. Her glance is that of the fabled basilisk, her voice a siren's voice. With her voice she enchants, with her beauty she deprives of reason. Voice and sight alike deal destruction and death. From English scholar Jean Lempriere in 1827, we get an explanation for what may have borne the stories of sirens. Some suppose that the sirens were a number of lascivious women in Sicily who prostituted themselves to strangers and made them forget their pursuits while drowned in unlawful pleasures. Their legend, from the time of Odysseus, would later be expanded upon through the works of linguist Jane Ellen Harrison, going so far as to liken them to the Keres, or Greek death spirits. They are mantic creatures, like the Sphinx, she said, with whom they have much in common, knowing both the past and the future. Their song takes effect at midday, in a windless calm. The end of that song is death. And now we come to the story I'm sure everyone has been waiting for. As the great Liam Neeson once said,
"Release the Kraken!"
Possibly no other name has struck more fear into the hearts of sailors and seafaring peoples in history than that of the Kraken. An early version of the creature can be found in the stories of Odysseus, mentioning the creature Scylla. The Scylla was a monster with 6 heads, which Odysseus had to sail past. During his voyage through the region between Sicily and the mainland of Italy known as the Strait of Messina. This later developed into the description given by Olaus Magnus in 1555, who spoke of a creature with sharp and long horns that looked like a tree held up by the roots. They are 10 or 12 cubits long, very black, with huge eyes. First described as the squeakrak by Italian writer Negri in the year 1700, the Kraken existed as a massive fish adorned with many horns and arms. It later developed into becoming a many-headed and many-clawed creature, akin to the Icelandic Hafgufa. One of the first true descriptions was given by missionary Hans Egede, who stated that the Kraken measured miles in length. When it surfaced, it seemed to cover the entire sea with its many heads and a number of claws. With the claws, it captured its prey, which could be anything from ships to men, fish, and animals, dragging them all down into the depths. Fishermen could even run aground on the body of the Kraken. The only way to make it go away was to say its name and drive it back into the deep. The Systema Naturae of 1735 was the first time the name Kraken was put into print. In the 1753 work of Eric Pontoppidan, the Kraken became a giant sea crab, then a starfish, and then later an octopus. The Bishop of Bergen single-handedly popularized the creature in the English-speaking world. The name Kraken, however, is actually derived from the Norwegian name Krake, that Pontoppidan brought forward in his book, The First Attempt at a Natural History of Norway. In his book, it was said that sometimes the creature would be mistaken for a series of small islands, with bountiful amounts of fish there. Of course, this is where the fishermen saying, "You must have fished on the Kraken" came from, for fishermen who had large catches. When the Kraken would submerge, it would leave an incredible whirlpool in its wake, which became known as the Muskstraumen, or the Maelstrom. To Pontoppidan, the Kraken was incontestably the largest sea monster in the world, with a width of 1.5 miles. It seems these are the creature's arms, he said, and it is said that if they were to lay hold of the largest man of war, they would pull it down to the bottom. And it would be through the work of Pierre Denis de Montfort, a famed French naturalist, that the world was given the image of the Kraken as a colossal octopus in a painting of it attacking the ship. But he also made the differentiation that there were 2 creatures, the colossal octopus and the Kraken octopus. His Kraken was a man-killer who tore apart shipwrecked people and divers, and was big enough to destroy a 3-masted ship. Montfort went so far as to blame these colossal octopuses for a loss of 10 British warships in 1782 and the capture of a further 6 French men-of-war ships. This all came about by the ship Ville de Paris. As it was sinking, the Ville de Paris sent up a distress signal, which was swallowed in the waves. Those ships who came to assist also suffered the same fate as the Ville. Of course, this would later be explained away by the presence of a major storm. The first believed official sighting of the Kraken came from a ship crossing from Lisbon to New York in 1813. They logged the sighting of a marine animal afloat at sea. It was 60 meters in length, covered in shells, and had many birds resting upon it. Over half a century later, in 1861, the French ship Atlantis recovered a large piece of squid that was later attributed to a giant squid. This was later remarked by many as having been the true explanation for the Kraken, simply a giant squid. One of the first modern descriptions we have of the creature comes from novelist Victor Hugo's Le Travailleur de la Mer in 1866. He speaks of the man-eating octopus, which is the Kraken, which is the pieuvre to those in the Channel Islands. This, of course, later influenced the modern depictions of the Kraken in Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, a work which also drew on the squid sighting of the Atlantis. We also have our modern-day adaptations of the creature, with the specter and enormity we know it as, from Clash of the Titans and the Pirates of the Caribbean. And of course, what would any episode be without a little conspiracy and flair? Following the discovery and footage of a giant squid by a deep-sea research team in Mexico in 2019, the United States Navy made headlines only 2 years later when it detonated a 40,000-pound blast in the middle of the Atlantic. The explanation given was that it was a trial to determine if the blast would affect its newest aircraft carrier, the Gerald R. Ford. Of course, conspiracy theorists everywhere didn't buy into that explanation. For them, it was an attempt to protect the planet from an underwater creature that might have devastated us, some even going so far as to analyze the color of the blast, believing it to be some kind of special bomb designed to kill sea creatures. Of course, this theory's a little out there. And lastly, I'll leave you with the most well-known work of literature that contributed and helped to popularize the legend of the Kraken, the appropriately titled sonnet, The Kraken, by Alfred Tennyson, from 1830. Below the thunders of the upper deep, far, far beneath in the abysmal sea, is ancient, dreamless, uninvaded sleep. The Kraken sleepeth, faintest sunlights flee. About his shadowy sides, above him swell huge sponges of millennial growth and height, and far away into the sickly light from many a wondrous grot and secret cell, unnumbered and enormous polypi winnow with giant arms the slumbering green, battening upon huge sea worms in his sleep, until the latter fire shall heat the deep. Then once again by man and angels to be seen, in roaring he shall rise, and on the surface die. So this message brings to close the first, hopefully of many, stories of the deep. we have discussed the famed city of militaristic and cultural fame, Atlantis, the sentencing songs of the cursed creatures known as the Sirens, and the most devastating and horrific sea creature of all, the Kraken. I truly hope you enjoyed these tales of the deep, and I look forward to bringing you more in the future. Before you go, please leave me a quick review or a thumbs up if you're watching on YouTube. Above all, remember to subscribe so you can find your way back next week when we venture back into the realm of the paranormal for an episode about the event regarded as the most amazing and horrifying exorcism in history. Some will know it as the story of Emma Schmidt, others by its more popularized name and her pseudonym, The Exorcism of Anna Eklund. New stories will release every Tuesday at our new time, midnight Eastern Standard Time, to allow those on the East Coast and beyond time to enjoy them a little sooner. But for now, it's time to close the cover of the Insidious agenda, and a reminder to keep your head above water, because you never know what lurks below. I'll see you again next week, and thank you for listening.